Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back again. This week we are covering Chapter 8, and so that is the subject of our presentation. This is going to be a little bit of a long one by virtue of the fact that we are covering the two basic types of cell division that eukaryotes undergo. If we were doing this in my more advanced biology class, the General Biology 1 class, we would actually cover these two processes in two separate chapters. But the authors of our textbook have decided that the two cell division processes ought to be covered in a single chapter. And I can understand why, because there is some commonality, as you'll see, between the two processes. So you could make a good argument for why you need to cover these in a single chapter. But that means that we have a lot of information to cover as far as this is concerned. As I've started to do with all of the presentations, this will be broken up into time chunks, divided by concept check questions and a full break if you need one. So there'll be an opportunity for you to actually end your observation or your I guess you're watching observation of the recording, and you can walk away and pick it up again wherever you want, and there will be separate links to each of the sections in the weekly overview and also in the chapter resources section in Canvas, so that you can pick it up wherever you choose to stop, wherever it is convenient for you at one of the breaks to stop, if that's what you choose to do. But if you are planning on watching this in one sitting, it's going to be a while. Because there is a reasonable amount of information here. That being said, there's also some very, very helpful animations and videos, YouTube videos in the resources section. If you like watching those videos and you've found them to be extremely helpful, this may be an alternative way for you to get access to the information that's covered in this section. Take advantage of everything that's available and use what works for you. I just want to let you know that this is likely to be a reasonably long presentation if you're going to try and watch it all at once. So that being said, let's get this going, because the sooner we start, obviously, the sooner we get finished. So the book, or the current edition of the textbook, talks about a female shark in Australia that started to produce offspring in the absence of a male. This process is called parthenogenesis, and it's not unusual, although it is rare in the animal kingdom, for parthenogenesis to take place. We know of a number of species where this is possible. So in a previous edition of the textbook, it actually talked about a giant lizard, the Komodo dragon, the largest lizard on the planet, that can be up to 14 feet in length. It challenges alligators and crocodiles in terms of size. They can be quite large, and they are predatory. They're also one of the few lizards that have a poisonous bite, and they live on the islands of Indonesia. There are two small islands in Indonesia where these giant lizards are located. And normally they reproduce sexually, just like the shark that's mentioned in the book. But some years ago, one of the dragons started to produce offspring in the absence of a male by parthenogenesis. And in fact, as I said, this is something that we are aware of. We know that it occurs in amphibians. We know that it occurs in fish. We know that there are species of lizards that live in the Mojave Desert in the southwest corner of the United States that are strictly female. They reproduce totally by parthenogenesis. And as you'll see a little bit later in this chapter, there are even tiny invertebrate animals that reproduce by parthenogenesis. And they have been the subject of a lot of investigation because of the length of time that they've been doing parthenogenesis. Now, parthenogenesis, strictly speaking, is a form of asexual reproduction, meaning that the offspring are clones of the parents. They're genetically identical to the parent, the female parent in this case. And in the case of parthenogenesis, it is always a female that is the parent. And so all of the offspring are genetically identical. And the one problem with that is that given that everyone is genetically identical or near genetically identical, if something should change in the environment, if a challenge should occur, a disease or some other environmental condition that is lethal to individuals in the population, then everyone is going to be affected because they are in essence genetically identical and are going to suffer the same consequences. That is the power of sexual reproduction, and it's something that we'll talk about when we get to talk about the second type of cell division, otherwise known as meiosis, which is the cell division that is associated with sexual reproduction. The point here is that parthenogenesis is, strictly speaking, not advantageous to species that develop it in the long term. And yet the little invertebrate animals that we're going to talk about later in the chapter, at best guess, have been doing it for about 50 million years. They simply should not be present, which is the reason why they're a very interesting organism to research. How do they manage to get away with reproducing by parthenogenesis for so long without suffering the consequences of it? I'll tell you a little bit more about that story when we get to talk about them. They're called bedelloid rotifers, and we'll talk more about them a little bit later in the presentation. So parthenogenesis as a process is simply a way for some organisms to reproduce in the absence of sex. It is a form of asexual reproduction. And obviously it means that the individuals are genetically identical to each other. It is a form of cloning. And nature has been cloning for billions of years because it's basically what bacterial cells do. They simply grow and divide. So every individual is genetically identical or near genetically identical to other individuals. And so it is a way for reproduction. And in terms of single-celled organisms, otherwise known as unicellular organisms, and organisms that reproduce asexually, whether they be multicellular or unicellular, cell division, where the cells are identical to each other, are the basis for reproduction. It is one of the roles of cell division. And in fact, cell division, as we're going to talk about it in this first section, what is referred to as mitosis, is all about cells making identical copies of each other. Now, obviously for asexually reproducing organisms and unicellular organisms, that type of cell division is sufficient for reproduction. But if you are sexually reproducing, if it requires two parents and the coming together of genetic information from both parents to give rise to offspring, then it turns out that mitosis is simply not going to cut it. It is not appropriate to use cells that are genetically identical to the parental cells as reproductive cells, as you'll see. And there's a really good reason why. So we do recognize and we do require a second type of cell division, otherwise known as meiosis, that changes the cellular product so that the cells are no longer genetically identical to each other. And that leads to the strength and the power of sexual reproduction because it creates the possibility for genetic variation. And genetic variation is at the heart of understanding why organisms that sexually reproduce are so successful. And it's the reason why the bedelloid rotifers are so interesting, because they fly in the face of that and continue to reproduce by parthenogenesis through asexual reproduction when they shouldn't really be able to do so. They should not be as successful as they are. So there's a lot of interesting things that we're going to talk about. At the same time, after we've discussed mitosis, we're going to stop briefly to talk about cancer. And the reason why is because the process of mitosis, general cell division, is also the type of cell division that is at the heart of understanding the origin of cancer. Because cell division, as we see it in mitosis, is very, very tightly regulated. We're not going to get very much into the details of that regulation. But cancer cells are simply cells that defy that regulation. And we'll talk a little bit about how they do so. And we'll talk a little bit about how the commonly used treatments for cancer target the way in which the cells defy the way in which cell division is regulated. So a lot of interesting things to talk about. And then obviously we're going to talk about meiosis, we're going to talk about sexual reproduction, we're going to start addressing the origin of genetic variation. We're going to look at some things that can go wrong during meiosis, but in the next chapter, we're going to take advantage of what we learn about meiosis in this chapter to start looking for patterns of inheritance. So one of the reasons why we delve into cell division in this chapter is to form the basis, the foundation for understanding the patterns of inheritance that we're going to talk about in the next chapter. So there are several reasons for digging deep into this chapter and trying to understand as best we can cell division. So let's move on and start talking about cell division. So what does cell division actually accomplish? What is the purpose of cell division? Well, it is all about reproduction of cells. And you may recall from chapter 1 that we actually encapsulate this in what is known as the cell theory of life. Now, the first part of the cell theory of life simply says that all organisms are composed of cells. It's the second part that encapsulates this idea of cell division, because it says that all existing cells come from pre-existing cells. And so when we take a look at our cells, and best estimates of the number of cells in an adult body is somewhere between 7 trillion and 10 trillion cells. If we work backwards in time, understanding that all the cells that are present right now come from cells that existed in the past, obviously we ought to be able to go backwards to the origin of our body. And when we do that, we go back to a single cell, which we refer to as the zygote. And that zygote is the product of the union of an egg and a sperm. And every cell in your body traces its origin back to that single cell. So the notion that cells can make copies of themselves is really important in our own growth and development. And those cells that are the product of the zygote and subsequent rounds of division are the product of a cell division known as mitosis, where the daughter cells are genetically identical to each other and genetically identical to the parent cell, to the zygote, the original parent cell, if you want to think of it that way. And so every cell in your body as a product of mitosis contains exactly the same set of chromosomes containing exactly the same set of genes. And in our later chapters, particularly in chapters 11 and 12, most particularly in chapter 11, we'll talk about how cells that contain the same sets of chromosomes and the same sets of genes wind up being very different from each other. It has everything to do with the way those genes are regulated. So we'll be delving into that a little bit in chapter 9 and chapter 10, but we'll dig deeper into it in chapter 11. How are the genes regulated so that cells that are genetically identical to each other with the same set of chromosomes and the same set of genes can turn out to be extremely different? There are about 220 different types of cells in your body, by the way, in case you didn't know that. So mitosis is at the heart of our growth and development. So after the zygote forms, after the egg and the sperm unite, mitosis kicks in. The zygote divides into 2 cells, which divide into 4 cells, which divide into 8 cells, until we get to our final adult form. It's all about mitosis. And you might think that by the time we get to our full adult form, there would be no further need for cell division, at least for mitosis. And you'd be wrong, Because what happens if a cell breaks down? You can't just leave a gap. What happens when you shed your skin, which you do on a constant basis? You may not realize this, but you turn over your skin approximately every 4 weeks. You don't do it in one large shedding. What you do is shed tiny fragments constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it amounts to completely turning your skin over every 4 weeks. And you turn over all your red blood cells every 3 or 4 weeks. And that's just the start. So as you can see, there is a role for cell division even after you reach your full adult size. It's because you're constantly replacing cells. What if you cut yourself? Your skin is your primary defense against the microorganisms on the outside that are desperately trying to get in, because you're a great place to live. And it's how you protect yourself from them. But as soon as you get cut, you break that barrier. And your body wants to heal that up and return the barrier to its normal, healthy condition, blocking all the pathogens that are sitting on the outside. The only way to do that is for cell division to take place. And so there is a role for replacement and there is a role for repair involving cell division. And it's mitosis that's involved. So mitosis as a cell division process carries out a number of important functions for a typical eukaryotic organism. It's involved in growth and development after the zygote forms. The remaining cells that make up your adult body are the product of mitosis. It's what allows that single cell to give rise to 220 different types of cells in your body. And there's some 7 to 10 trillion cells that make up your body right now. And by the way, you may not have realized this, but when you woke up this morning, you had about 450 million new cells that you didn't have yesterday. So again, it just reinforces the fact that mitosis is an ongoing process, even after you reach your adult form and your adult size, where you may think that the necessity for mitotic cell division is done. Well, no, it's not, because you're constantly repairing and replacing, repairing damage, replacing cells. It's an ongoing process. In fact, the process of aging, as best we can tell, is the loss of this ability to repair and replace. Over time, our ability to repair and replace becomes degraded, and it's part of old age. Just ask anyone who is aging whether their repair and replacement mechanism seems to be working as effectively as it did when they were younger. And I'm pretty sure the answer that you will get is not so much. So again, the whole notion of cell division as an ongoing lifetime process is something that we need to recognize. It's not just about growth and development. It's about ongoing repair and replacement as well. But then the other thing that we also need to bear in mind, and this is just a short video of cells undergoing mitotic division. So a cell will split into 2, and those cells will split into 2 as well to give you 4 cells. And you can find this in the resource section. So let me just make a note here. For those of you who are watching along, this is available. In the resource page. I guess I'm for chapter 8, just in case you didn't know. Okay. Just to make sure that you've got the information. So this is just a short video that shows cells dividing. So this notion of cells of ongoing mitotic cell division, where the division is making identical cells, this is a lifetime process. It's not just growth and development. This is a lifetime process. And for organisms that reproduce asexually, it is how they reproduce themselves. And it's not just unicellular organisms that can do this. There are a number of multicellular organisms that are capable of asexual reproduction. As we've seen, parthenogenesis, that is a type of asexual reproduction, and it is mitosis that's involved there. You may have heard that you can cut up a sea star into fragments. So long as each fragment has a piece of the central disc, all the missing pieces can be replaced. And in fact, there's an interesting side story there. In California, the abalone fishermen used to hate the sea stars because they figured that the sea stars were eating the abalones. They were in competition with them. And so whenever they saw a sea star, they would take the big knife that they used to lever the abalones off the rocks and cut the sea stars up into pieces and throw them back into the water, not realizing that all they were doing was reproducing the sea stars asexually and actually adding to the population of sea stars, not killing them off, but adding to the population of sea stars because of their ability to regenerate the missing pieces. And if you've ever taken a cutting from a plant and stuck it in the ground and produced a new plant from it, that's asexual reproduction, and that involves mitosis. And in fact, we do take advantage of this because we can now clone plants even more definitively. For about the last 50 or 60 years, it's been possible to clone plants not by taking cuttings, but by taking small pieces of leaf tissue and exposing them to the right chemicals and getting from that a clump of cells that we call a callus. And then by changing the chemical combination, we can trigger those cells to grow little plantlets out of the clump. And each one of those plantlets is a clone of the original or a near identical clone to the original. And as long as you look after those, they'll start to grow shoots and leaves and roots and turn into a full plant. And then you can cut them out and plant them into a pot, nurse them along until they can self-support themselves. And then you have new plants, all without any sexual reproduction. No seeds, no pollen, no sexual reproduction. It's strictly cloning. And if you've ever bought a orchid, either from the roadside or from a supermarket or a nursery or somewhere like that, it is almost certain, in fact, it's 100% certain that those orchids were produced by that cloning mechanism. And it is, again, asexual reproduction. People make a lot of money by cloning orchids. And the reason why is because even though orchids produce seeds, it's really, really, really difficult to get those seeds to germinate and grow into a new plant. It's estimated that only about 1 in 100 orchid seeds will actually germinate to give you a new plant, which is not really good. And if you're trying to grow orchids, that makes it a bit of a challenge. But now that they can be cloned, it's an easy way of making identical copies of the same orchid once you've got one. And again, in one of our later chapters, and I believe it's chapter 11 again. Yeah, it's chapter 11 because chapter 12 is DNA technology. In chapter 11, we'll talk a little bit more about cloning, both animal cloning and plant cloning. What's good and what's bad about each of those. But again, it's a form of asexual reproduction. It revolves around mitosis as the form of cell division involved in this reproduction. But for those that reproduce sexually, you need to produce gametes. And the big deal about gametes, eggs and sperm, is that they are not genetically identical either to each other or to the parent cell that gave rise to them. And there's a really good reason for that I'll explain in more detail when we get to meiosis a little bit later in this presentation. But it means that we do need a separate type of cell division associated with sexual reproduction, and that is meiosis. And that's something that we'll also be talking about in this presentation, in this chapter. So we have two types of eukaryotic cell division. We've got mitosis, which is for growth and development, for repair and replacement, for those eukaryotes that reproduce sexually, which is, by the way, the vast majority of eukaryotic organisms, even eukaryotic organisms that might typically reproduce asexually will revert to reproducing sexually if the environmental conditions get too hostile, because asexual reproduction does not produce genetic variation, but sexual reproduction does. And so, as you'll see, genetic variation is a very important piece of the puzzle for ongoing success of a species, which means that meiosis, because of its ability to produce genetic variation, must be a key part of the puzzle for any successful eukaryotic organism. They must be using meiosis and sexual reproduction at some point to create the genetic variation that leads to the success of the organism long term. And again, we'll talk more about that when we get to meiosis. So this is just a diagram or a picture that illustrates the various notions of cell division. So, and I'm specifically focusing on mitosis because that's what we're going to talk about for the next section. So replacement, growth, and development. And remember, this is repair and replacement. So repair of tissues and replacement of worn out cells. And then for those organisms that reproduce asexually, it is the way they reproduce themselves. So amoebas are single-celled microorganisms. These are kind of cool and fun to look at under the microscope because they're constantly changing shape. But they reproduce themselves simply by splitting in two. So that's a form of asexual reproduction. We refer to it as binary fission, which literally means to split in two. But they are eukaryotic organisms. Then we talked about the sea star example, and here you can see some sea stars busily regenerating missing pieces. So this one is being regenerated from this arm plus a little bit of the central disc. So these are all the replacement pieces. So you can see what I meant when I said, so long as the chunk that you cut contains a little bit of the central disc, you can literally replace everything else. And here's another one at a more advanced stage. Again, this is probably the piece that it all started from, that had a little bit of the central disc attached, and these are all the replacement pieces. And then growing a cutting of a plant, you just stick it in the ground. These are African violets, which are really easy to regenerate this way. And in fact, in agriculture, this is quite a common practice. So every banana that you eat, you like bananas? Every one of those bananas is a product of a cloning, because banana plants reproduce asexually. Again, bananas do have seeds. If you cut a banana open, you'll see little black spots inside the banana. Those are the banana seeds, but they're all sterile. So the only way to actually reproduce bananas is through cloning by asexual reproduction. Same with strawberries. Strawberries are very hard to grow from seeds, but you can grow them from cuttings. And so the vast majority of strawberries are grown this way. Potatoes are grown from the eyes on the potato. So if you leave a potato in the dark for a length of time, it will actually start to sprout a stem out of the potato. And if you cut that section up and put it in and plant it in the ground, you'll get a potato plant, because it will reproduce asexually. And there are lots of agricultural plants that get reproduced this way. So it's an important part of our actual food system, our food chain, that we have to reproduce some of our plants asexually. So it's kind of an important concept. So let's take a break for a moment, and I will turn off the recording here so that if you want to take a quick break, grab a drink, grab a snack, go to the bathroom, whatever you want to do, stop and think about the concept check question before you get the answer at the beginning of the next section. Feel free to do so. There will be a link to allow you to jump to the next section in the resource page and also on the weekly overview. or you can just click on the button at the bottom and jump straight to the next section. Anyway, here's our concept check question. Eukaryotic organisms use two types of cell division, mitosis and meiosis. That's what we've been talking about. What are the functions or roles of these two cell divisions in the life of a typical eukaryote? I'll see you on the other side of the break.